What is going on, you beautiful people? Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a simple man. I love a good list, a good review, top 10, top 100 type list reviewing, ranking content. So when I saw a journalist at IGN was attempting to rank the top 100 PlayStation games of all time, well, I thought, let's see how this is gonna go. Again, this is IGN. We're talking about the publication, the journalist review site that gave Alien Isolation a solid, like 5.9 out of 10, with probably one of their most, ridiculous, controversial reviews of all time. Simultaneously, IGN giving games like Pokemon Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu an 8.3 out of 10, which for fans of the Pokemon series is just like a straight up slap in the face. I mean, games journalists really aren't the, well, they're not the pinnacle of, the journalism art medium, are there? And it feels like the games journalists, kind of as a whole online, still haven't recovered since that notorious, Cuphead review, say, 7 years ago that went viral. And for many games fans out there, myself included, IGN still have not recovered from that absolutely dreadful Alien Isolation review.
And it turns out to be a hugely disappointing and frustrating slog.
However, since the IGN staff went to the trouble of ranking the top 100 PlayStation games of all time, I thought we'd give it a little look-see and see exactly what kind of hot takes they got going on, what games that they should have included, what games that they excluded, and what their top 10 is. So right away, I have to say that a lot of the games that you would expect to see on a top 100 list of PlayStation games of all time show up. You got your Resident Evils, your Silent Hills, your Souls-like game, your mini plethora of Rockstar games that fill a lot of this list, along with a bunch of PlayStation classics like Spyro, the Jack series. There are a few interesting inclusions on this list from games I've never heard of to games that personally I don't think deserve to be on this list. Like putting a game like Destiny at 63 in the top 100 PlayStation games of all time, I think is a interesting choice to say the least. I'm not saying it doesn't deserve to be on this, but would I put it in the top 60 games, 70 games of all time? No. To me, it would probably go somewhere between 90 and 100. The fact that Destiny is ranked higher than a game like Bully, a game that I think is arguably Rockstar's probably most underrated game of all time, is tragic to me. To me, a game like Bully has got to be a top 50 PlayStation game of all time. Bully echoes back to a time when Rockstar was willing to take more risks on smaller indie projects, and Bully, in my opinion, has one of the best video game soundtracks of all time, not just one of the best Rockstar game soundtracks of all time. So the fact that Bully does make the list, I think, is great, but to see it not even crack the top 50 when almost every single Grand Theft Auto game cracked the top 50, to me is an insult. Another game that I was surprised that didn't make this list, when we've got games like this, Parappa the Rapper, a game I've never even heard of, not saying it's good or bad, but again, never even heard of it making the list. It's a game like the original Star Wars Battlefront. Maybe I'm alone in thinking this, but the original Star Wars Battlefront to me is a classic PlayStation game, a game that exudes the PlayStation 2 energy from my childhood. I mean, Star Wars Battlefront released in 2004 on Windows, Xbox, and PlayStation 2, but let's be honest, if you were playing this game, you were probably playing it on PlayStation 2. And Star Wars Battlefront is one of those iconic original Star Wars games that were actually good before Star Wars games, Star Wars was bought by Disney and they started going down the trash can. Another interesting pick, something that I was really surprised to see be on this list, let alone be number 51 out of 100 top PlayStation games of all time, is the Telltale Walking Dead series. Now, this game is good, whether you are a Walking Dead fan or not, or a fan of Telltale games. I personally really enjoy Telltale games, but to put this number 51 in a top 100 list, again above games like Marvel's Spider-Man 2, Bully, Arkham City, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, a bunch of PlayStation classics, to me is a bit puzzling. At the end of the day, this is a Telltale game, and I don't even think it's the best Telltale game, if I'm being honest. And to see it ranked above games, again, like Bully, Prince of Persia, a classic PlayStation game from my childhood, to me is really surprising. In the same vein, to see a game like Helldivers 2 that released in February 8th of 2024 be ranked 71 on this list and be ranked higher than games like Need for Speed Underground 2, Yakuza 0, Kingdom Hearts 2, SSX Tricky, Doom Eternal. What are we doing here? The fact that Doom Eternal is ranked 86 on the top 100 PlayStation games of all times is criminal. What are we doing here, IGN? They ranked a Tetris game from 2018 higher than SSX Tricky and Doom Eternal. Like, excuse me? What the fuck? Another thing that kind of shocked me was the fact that 3 Resident Evil games were ranked in the top 100, specifically the original Resident Evil, Resident Evil 4, the remake, which dropped in 2023, and Resident Evil 2, the remake, which dropped in 2018. Where is Resident Evil 7, the game that literally brought the Resident Evil franchise back to life and paved the way for these Resident Evil remakes? The fact that we're seeing remakes, which don't get me wrong, the Resident Evil remakes, the most recent ones, 4 and 2, were good. But the fact that those are on this list, the fact that Resident Evil 2, the remake, which dropped in 2018, is on this list at number 11, almost cracking into the top 10, but Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, my favorite Resident Evil game, isn't even on this list, is, that's insanity to me. As well, another game that I knew was going to be ranked high, and I know that some people are going to have issues with, is The Last of Us Part 2, which they ranked at number 12, and I'm not too surprised considering that IGN did give The Last of Us 2 a 10 out of 10, a perfect score rating. Now, I love The Last of Us. Absolutely fantastic game series, both parts 1 and part 2, and the television show is also phenomenal. Is Last of Us Part 2 a 10 out of 10 game, though? No, I don't think it is. I think a 9 out of 10 is perfectly reasonable, and personally, I think I prefer Last of Us Part 1 over The Last of Us Part 2. Because I knew they ranked The Last of Us Part 2 a 10 out of 10, they gave it a perfect score, they called it a perfect game. I knew it was going to be ranked high, I thought it was going to be in the top 25, but to see it almost crack the top 10 is pretty wild to me, and to see it ranked higher than games like, I don't know, Persona 5, which barely cracks the top 25 at number 25 is a little wild to me. Again, though, knowing how IGN reviews games, this also wasn't too surprising to me. Also, to see a game like Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare be ranked on this list, don't get me wrong, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, classic game, all-time, probably one of the best Call of Duties of all time, especially to like millennials out there. This game really did kind of revolutionize and change like online FPS gaming, but maybe this is just me. To me, this is an Xbox game, an Xbox 360 game, a classic Xbox game, not a classic PlayStation game. Maybe that's because I played the game on Xbox Live on Xbox, but to me, Modern Warfare, the Call of Duty franchise, don't scream PlayStation games to me. This game definitely deserved to be on this list, but to be number 21 on the top 100 PlayStation games, again, maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm biased because I played this game on Xbox. I don't think this is a classic PlayStation game when I think of PlayStation games. Now, this might be a bit of a hot take from IGN, but personally, I agree with them. In my opinion, Bloodborne is the best Souls-like game of all time. Absolutely love Bloodborne. I love the Cthulhu kind of world-inspired mythos of Bloodborne. I love the combat of Bloodborne. I just love everything about it. And personally, in my opinion, Bloodborne is probably my favorite Souls-like game of all time. And I personally would also probably put it in the top 10 PlayStation games of all time. But I was pleasantly surprised to see them rank it number 3 of all PlayStation games of all time, which I actually think is probably a spot-on opinion. An opinion, though, that probably has gamers and PlayStation fans in their fields is the decision to put God of War 2018, the kind of new kind of, resurgence God of War game, at number 2 out of all time, out of the top top 100 PlayStation games. Now, don't get me wrong, this game is fantastic, but for God of War fans, this game did kind of pivot away from what, God of War up until this point, kind of was. God of War 2018 is a masterpiece. It is an absolutely fantastic game, but it is a large pivot away from what God of War was before, pivoting from a kind of, slasher, beat 'em up, bloody, kind of that type of a game, the old school God of War games, into this new school, like, high budget, basically like an interactive movie type game. And don't get me wrong, I think it's fantastic. God of War 2018 is a fantastic game. God of War Ragnarok is a fantastic game. It is an amazing story. It is very much a kind of interactive movie type game in the level of budget that went into the story production, into the voice acting, into just, writing the story, the visuals, all of it together. But it is very much a shift away from what God of War kind of was for people who played the original God of War franchise series. And then putting it at number 2 of all time PlayStation games is definitely a hot take. Another game that I was actually really happy to see making into the top 10, IGN actually putting it in the top 5, is Shadow of the Colossus, an absolute classic PlayStation game. Shadow of the Colossus was one of those games that made me kind of realize what exactly the scope of gaming could be. Shadow of the Colossus was an absolute brilliant, breathtaking display in early PlayStation technology, and just showed to the scale of what gaming could be. Obviously, when you look back at Shadow of the Colossus now from a graphics point of view, it doesn't hold up. It is kind of polygon-y, but still as a concept, as an idea, Shadow of the Colossus to me is one of my favorite games of all times, and it really showed again just what potential gaming could be, the potential scope and epicness that you could display with gaming. And the fact that this game was released in 2005 really, I think, shows just how far ahead it was of it at its time when this game released. Another game that I was actually kind of shocked to see make the top 10 on IGN's list is Baldur's Gate 3. I think this is an interesting decision because, again, I played Baldur's Gate 3 on the PC, and I don't generally associate Baldur's Gate 3 with PlayStation games, but this is a fantastic game. It is probably one of the best games to come out in the last few years. Definitely one of the best games of 2023, and one of the best, this type of Dungeons and Dragons, converted strategy games, a Divinity-esque game, I think, of all time in this genre. To me, it really seems like they just wanted to stick Baldur's Gate 3 into this list because it is a fantastic, amazing game, not because it's an amazing PlayStation game. I think they did this with a few games, but I think this game, Baldur's Gate 3, is definitely the epitome of them just wanting to stick, just a fabulous game overall into a top 100 PlayStation games of all time. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I definitely do think that if you're gonna make a top 100 PlayStation games that are supposed to be iconic PlayStation games, that you probably should lean into more of the iconic PlayStation side, not just putting just amazing games for amazing games onto the list, especially when you compare it to the game that follows it, Grand Theft Auto 5, arguably the most iconic of the Grand Theft Auto series. Rockstar games in general really just are classic PlayStation games to me. I mean, there's 5 Rockstar games on this list, and I think that there is so for a reason. I mean, there's 2 Rockstar games, I believe, in the top 10 with Grand Theft Auto 5 and Red Dead Redemption 2, arguably my favorite of the Rockstar games. I think Red Dead 2 is easily my favorite, easily one of the best Rockstar games ever made, and I do think that it deserves a top 10 place along with GTA 5. They're just iconic PlayStation games, iconic Rockstar games. To me, game studios like Capcom, Konami, Square Enix, Naughty Dog, From Software, Rockstar, these are the classic PlayStation game studios. And so it's really not any surprise that we see these studios' games and litter the top 20, PlayStation games of all times, again, with games Grand Theft Auto 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, Final Fantasy, Uncharted, The Last of Us. These types of games are iconic PlayStation games, and so it was kind of a shoo-in that they were going to make the top 10. I have to say, though, that I was a bit surprised by what IGN said was the #1 PlayStation game of all time, Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear as a franchise is really popular, but the first Metal Gear Solid is a bit of a niche game, especially when you compare it to like many other games on this list. Probably the fact that it came out in 1998, and a lot of other, I think, fans of Metal Gear maybe prefer some of the more modern Metal Gear games, maybe such as like 5, 4, or even 2. Personally, if I was going to pick a Metal Gear Solid game to be in the top 10 PlayStation games of all time, it would probably be Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, but I think that's just because it's my favorite game. I think that putting Metal Gear Solid, the original game, in the top 10, there's nothing wrong with it. Having it #1, though, I have to say I was a bit surprised. To me, I would probably expect to see games like Final Fantasy VII, Red Dead Redemption 2, Grand Theft Auto 5, Bloodborne, God of War even, these types of games be #1. There's a reason that all of those games are in the top 10, top 20, and I would think that more often than not, fans would probably put those games at #1. I was going to pick a PlayStation game to be the #1 PlayStation game of all time. It would probably be either Bloodborne, Grand Theft Auto 5, or Red Dead Redemption 2. I think that any of those games could easily take up the #1 spot, and it would probably be my top 3, my 1, 2, 3, it would probably be those games. But again, that's just my opinion. Those are my personal favorite games. Overall, this list isn't horrible, but there are definitely things I disagree with, like Bully being criminally underrated, Horizon Zero Dawn being criminally underrated at 87, the fact that God of War 2 is ranked lower than God of War Ragnarok, seemingly this list and IGN staff preferring the newer type of kind of PlayStation games, specifically in the newer God of War. Last of Us 2 is probably a little bit higher than I would rate it, and overall, I think that the list kind of shifted away from its original intent, from being a list that ranks the top 100 PlayStation games to being a list that just ranks top 100 games of all time that happen to also be played on PlayStation. Not saying that this list needs to be full of PlayStation exclusives, but there was definitely some games on this list that I agree are really good, but they just aren't games that I would necessarily associate with PlayStation, if that makes sense. At the end of the day, though, these are just my thoughts and opinions, and at the end of the day, this is a list full of thoughts and opinions from people who I mostly agree with. So let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. What did you think of the IGN Top 100 PlayStation Games list? What is your top PlayStation game, top 5 PlayStation games of all time? And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, learned something new, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. It's the easiest way to support me, and it really does go a long way in putting these videos into the algorithm. Let me know in the comment section down below as well if you like these kind of more off-the-cuff type videos, these kind of rant, less formatted videos, non-scripted videos, and I may do more of them. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one. Stay safe out there. Until next time, peace, love, adu.